This event is a Center of Islamic Studies event, and what we're trying to do is to have a discussion around one of our projects, and we're calling it a pre-launch discussion. This is not a launch discussion, but a pre-launch discussion. I will say a few things about this project, and then I'll invite my colleagues and introduce them as we invite them to come here to address certain aspects of this, of the resulting report. Now, our project, coming under the title Contextualising Islam in Britain, is and was a government-funded project. We are launching a discussion today about the second phase of that report. The first phase was published in 2010, and it was done in association then and with the new phase with the Universities of Exeter and the Universities of Exeter and Westminster. The report and the project tries to answer a simple question, and the question is, what does it mean to live faithfully as a Muslim in Britain or as a British Muslim? In order to do this, we had as a group to devise not a methodology but a framework to apply to the process of generating ideas, generating themes, generating questions, and also inviting people to participate. When we got the project allocated to us here in Cambridge, we, with Exeter, Westminster, and other actors that I will be introducing today, started with establishing a steering group. The steering group came from different parts of the United Kingdom, and the steering group was charged with the task of, first of all, deciding on the actual themes of the project, and then thinking of sub-themes within those themes, and then generating questions with each sub-theme that then become the topics around which discussions and debates and presentations would take place. The second phase of Contextualising Islam in Britain revolved around four themes. The first one was the individual and the community. The second one was about gender and equality. The third was about the common good and political participation. And the fourth was about education, not in that order. When we have decided about those themes, we set about trying to generate members of the project. We were aiming at 25, 30. In the end, sometimes we had 40, 42, 43 people coming to the different symposia of the project. Each symposium lasted for 2 days, a weekend, and we had 4 symposia. So we had 8 days of intensive discussion around the themes and the questions that we had generated as a group. So how did we select people to take part in this project? The steering group had to think of representation. Of course, we couldn't do it with absolute accuracy. We tried to be as honest as possible and to reflect the different demographics, faith inflections amongst Muslims. So we set up as categories, age, gender, about faith inflections, ethnic backgrounds. We talked about heritage Muslims, new Muslims, lifestyles, and geographical locations. And then we set about to invite people from those categories, and sometimes a person represented 1 or 2 or 3 categories. For example, my colleague and my friend, Shainul Jiwa, represented a particular faith inflection within Islam, but also she lives in Scotland, and she was also a female academic, so she represented 1 or 2 categories. We met here in the Muller Institute over 4 weekends. We had intensive debates and discussions and presentations. The debates and presentations and discussions took us in different directions. We sometimes agreed, sometimes did not agree, sometimes violently disagreed with each other, but remained loyal to the project, and we did that within the bounds, of course, and the limits of courtesy and open discussion and debate. A lot of people have contributed to this project, and I want to, first of all, thank the steering group, not all of whom are here, The steering group consisted of Muhammad Abdulaziz, who was also one of the major architects of this project. He worked for some time as an advisor to the Department of Communities and Local Government, and had a very strong hand in shaping many reports and many projects that took place under the last government and a little bit under this government. Shainul was another member of the steering group. She also came with experience from the first project and also represented certain perspectives on the themes of the project. The third person on the steering group here is Sajjad Rizvi, Dr. Sajjad Rizvi from the University of Exeter. He was a member of the first project, the first phase of the project, and again the second phase. And Sajjad built on the good work that was done by Muhammad, taking the questions with Yahya, and Yahya is not here, and started to develop those questions which came back to the steering group, and then they were reiterated, and then they were agreed by the whole group. And one person who was right at the very inception before we got involved in this project. Now, Dr. Anas Sheikh Ali chaired the first advisory group that then interviewed different applicants, and then in the end decided with others to allocate the project to us, when then we invited Exeter and Westminster to be part of it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time giving you the background to this, because I think there's a very important task ahead of us, which is for people to present aspects of it. So we have Sajjad, Dr. Sajjad Rizvi, who will be talking about gender and equality, part of the project. And then Dr. Shainul Jiwa, she will be actually standing in for Jeremy Hansel Thomas. Unfortunately, he can't be with us for this particular part of the conference, who would have spoken on education if he had been with us, but she's going to speak in his name and then participate after that in her own name in her own capacity on this. And then Muhammad Abdulaziz will be talking on the issue of individual and community, and also will stretch himself to perhaps say a few things about political participation if we need to. And then we have two colleagues and friends. Well, they are friends now. I hope that they will emerge as friends at the end of the process, who will be providing an external critique of the project. They were not members of it, but people who we thought would provide us with some external assessment, telling us where we went wrong, where we went sort of perhaps got in the right direction, any cul-de-sacs that we got ourselves into, and we welcome their contribution, and their Dr. Ed Kessler from the Wolf Institute and Professor Hugh Goddard from Edinburgh. So I'm going to stop now. I'm going to start by inviting Muhammad Abdulaziz to speak to you on the topic of the individual and the community, and may also talk about other things. He has 5 to 7 minutes. I'm going to be very strict on time. That's what we've agreed. Because we really want to have a discussion with you as audience.
Okay, Yasir mentioned that I worked as an advisor in Whitehall for a while, and this is really where this project started for me. It goes back to the days of Ruth Kelly, who, when faced with what we used to call the Muslim question in government, suggested that what we need to address the issues concerning Muslims in Britain was more theology rather than less theology. So in a sense, she was going diametrically opposite to Alistair Campbell, who had previously said, we don't do God in government. And she asked me if I would give some thought to this project. And we did in government, because our impression in government, and this relates very much to the topic that I'm going to speak on, seeing as I've only got 5 minutes, I'll stick to individual and community actually, and maybe we'll pick up on the political stuff later on in the discussions. Our impression in government was that many of the policy issues with regards to British Muslims went back to this question of the relationship between individuals and community. Our understanding or diagnosis or prognosis of the issues, though, was not consistent. So, for example, on issues to do with arranged marriage or treatment of women or honor killing, our feeling was very much that the community was overly imposing on the individual rights of individual Muslims. But then on the issue of disorder, or disturbances, as in the northern city disturbances, and on extremism and terrorism, the feeling in government was very much that the community was not taking enough responsibility with regards to individuals from the British Muslim communities. So it was a very, very mixed picture, but nonetheless, it was an issue that we felt would be good to address. And so we were particularly grateful to the steering group, Yasir and Sajjad and others who were involved in putting the questions together and the design together for these seminars. We were very grateful that they actually did take on the suggestion from us that we have some focused discussion on individual and community. It's ironic for me then that having commissioned the work to Yasir and Sajjad, that I'm back here reporting back on the committee and the discussion. Only Yasir could do something like this. I think we started off with some very easy conclusions in the discussion group. And the conclusion was, the starting point was very much that the West emphasizes individuals, individualism, the right of individuals, leading perhaps to excessive individualism, rampant individualism, maybe even hedonism of the worst type. And that Islam emphasized very much community, and perhaps that led to oppression of individuals within Muslim communities. But I think we did away with these sort of very simplistic starting points quite early on. And the discussion for me was in two parts. The first part was very much about the theory. And it was fascinating for me, particularly a paper presented by Talal, who wasn't able to be with us here today. It was fascinating for me watching Talal present this paper and to take all the imams that were there from various different backgrounds, Deobandi, Brelvi, Salafi, Sufi, to take them through the development of the concept of individualism in Western thought. Through the Protestant Reformation and the precedents to the individual's relationship to God, emphasizing personal responsibility and accountability over obedience and religious hierarchy, which they could relate to, and they could see the patterns of that discussion within their own heritage. Through the Renaissance and the emphasis on human dignity, intellectual freedom, and the emancipation of the ego, through to the discussion on the modern period, the advent of capitalism, the nation state, and the notions of self-interest, liberty, and rights, through to the Second World War and the Nuremberg trials, and the idea of individual responsibility in the face of atrocities in the Second World War, particularly the Holocaust, and then through all the way to the international instruments on human rights, and the balancing of rights and responsibility within that document. And the point here was that this development of the concept of the individual in Western thought was very much in the context of previous dominance of community, society, the state. And I suppose that that conflict between the individual and the community is very much still there, and speaks against the simplistic, the very simple starting points that we started off with. And I suppose if we were having that discussion today, the issue of gay marriage would have been very much a part of that discussion, in terms of how, despite the development of individual rights, equality for the individual on grounds of sexual orientation, etc., there is still this tension that gay people are now seeking the idea of gay marriages because of the impact of the recognition of marriage by wider society, wider community, and that the impact that has on their lives when their partnerships, civil partnerships, are not recognized or given the same status in the same way in wider society. So that was a very, very interesting discussion on the development of the concept of the individual in Western thought. And with this then, we had a presentation alongside that, a separate presentation on the conception of the individual in Islam, in Islamic theology. And we borrow very much here, I think, from Parvez Manzoor, when he talks about, in his articles, he talks about the two paradigmatic relationships in the Quran between God and the human being. On the one hand, God, He's the Lord, He's the Creator, and the human being is the abd, the servant, the worshipping, the spiritual. The human being is the mukallaf, in full possession of his or her faculties, capable of discharging legal and social responsibilities, and fully accountable for his or her own actions. And within this idea of the individual, then, is also the idea of the spiritual individual, the individual who seeks to achieve excellence, ihsan, the muhsin, striving for excellence, but beyond that is also striving for the kamil, perfection. And this is one notion of the individual in Islamic theology. A second notion of the individual, the second paradigmatic relationship in the Quran, is that of God as the creator and the individual as the khalifa, or the representative of God on earth, with responsibilities to him or herself for development, for growth, individual rights, and justice to the self, but also to the other. The other in terms of the community, the other in terms of society, the other in terms of humanity at large, and the other in terms of the environment, including all living and non-living things. And this leads to the understanding, then, of the self in relation to khidmah, in relation to service to community and society. So here, it's not just about individualism, it's about the individual responsibility, which then leads to a conception of the community. And it's in the writings of Allama Iqbal, or the writings of Allama Iqbal, that we relied on then to bring these two conceptions together of the individual as abd and the individual as khalifa, the representative of God on earth. Particularly Iqbal's understanding or Iqbal's use of the word khudi, the individual who strives, being accountable, strives to achieve the state of ihsan, the state of kamil, but through stewardship and service to the community, including prominence, including giving prominence, 2 minutes, okay, to the concept of maslahah, the public good. So, in some sense, in both the Western arena and the Islamic arena then, there is this idea of the coexistence, a tension and a working out between the individual and the community and society. And there was a feeling that both in the Western arena, but also in the Islamic arena, that this tension is never quite resolved. The balance that needs to be achieved between these two things are never quite achieved. But one is constantly striving to find that balance, to find that perfection between the two poles. And I suppose in both communities, in both arenas, we get it right sometimes and we get it wrong sometimes. And one of the areas that we explored in particular was the area of blasphemy, where clearly a lot of the modern scholarship would suggest that the Muslim community got it quite wrong. So the idea of the death punishment for apostasy, the curtailment of the individual right to change one's religion, confused right at the beginning with the idea of protecting the community, giving community the upper hand in the legal framing of this discussion, and the legal working out is now considered to be quite wrong. And the literature, whether one looks at stuff written by Taha Jabir Alwani or Mahmoud Ayyub, would suggest that actually this punishment for apostasy was not for apostasy at all, but for high treason. And that we can understand. We can understand that such a punishment, although draconian in our terms today, in today's terms, draconian as it is, that punishment could stand for something like high treason, but it's absolutely not the right response to apostasy. I'm going to mention very, very quickly a couple more points because I know my time's nearly up.
Yep.
So this was a theory, and then in terms of practice, clearly there is a tension between the individual community and British Muslim communities. And this is not always down to theology. And there are at least 3 other reasons for this tension. And I'm just going to mention them very, very quickly. Generational differences, culture, and patriarchy. So many of the issues that we would have discussed under the individual and community, whether it's honor killing,
really have to
honor killing.
Yeah.
Okay. And then the third one was the majority-minority dynamics. And then the penultimate point is that this discussion has impact on 2 particular groups. And the first is women, which Sajjad will talk about. And the second is young people. And there's a whole section on the discussion on young people, which I haven't got the time to go into, but I can pick up on in the discussion.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Shainul, you're presenting on behalf of Jeremy.
Okay, so my task is much easier this afternoon because I am, as Yasser said, I am presenting what Jeremy has already given as a given text. So I'm afraid you'll hear me reading rather than speaking to you. So these are Jeremy's thoughts on the summation of our discussion on this section on education.
Can you come close to me?
Yes, I can try. I can certainly try. All right. So the 2-day symposium on education reported in this series of seminars took place before the conference on reforms in Islamic education, jointly sponsored by the Prince Alwaleed Centres at Cambridge and Edinburgh Universities, held last April here in Cambridge. There was some convergence in the fundamental questions and issues discussed at both events. What is Islamic education? What is the reality behind the heated debates over the role of madrasas? Does Islamic education lead to a greater segregation, or can it foster genuine pluralism? Can faith-based education nurture critical thinking? How is the relationship between Islamic educational institutions, the state, and the national curriculum to be defined? However, whereas the later conference highlighted the different political and social contexts facing Islamic educational institutions across the world, the discussions reported in our seminars focus squarely on the British context. The report therefore refers to a range of documentary sources, case studies, and personal experiences which have direct bearing on the quality of the education experienced by young Muslims in Britain today and how this experience might be improved, whether within Muslim educational settings or within mainstream education, where the vast majority of young Muslims are in fact educated. Participants also discussed the problem of ideologically motivated attacks on some Muslim schools, orchestrated by think tanks and the media and unsupported by credible evidence, as well as more objective reports that reflect higher standards of journalism. It was noted how biased reports provoke a natural defensiveness which make it more difficult to address legitimate concerns about the quality of education in such schools and about the necessity for an internal critique of curriculum and pedagogy. To the list of sources informing the discussions amongst the participants, it is of course necessary to add the most important sources of all, the primary texts of Islam, including the comprehensive vision of human faculties in the Quran and the rich traditions of Islamic thought and civilization. Educational implications of such sources include the cultivation of intellectual curiosity, independent inquiry and empirical observation, the development of character, ethical values and spirituality, and the execution of charitable deeds and community service. It is important to stress that, like the other sections of the report, the section on education is very far from simply a statement of principles or an evidence base derived from documentary sources. The report is above all a record of open and candid discussions in which various perspectives were aired, and which do not adhere to any monolithic or unambiguous position, even though a broad consensus often emerged on major issues, challenges, and opportunities. If I were to identify one central theme throughout the discussions under which many others might be subsumed, it would be the recognition of the pressing need to go beyond simplistic dichotomies, which is what Muhammad Abdulaziz, of course, also reiterated in his remarks. A common thread, for example, was the need to go beyond the assumed dichotomy between secular and religious education. And this reflected the core idea repeated in other sections of the report, that there is no necessary opposition between faith identity and secular society. The misleading dichotomy between secularity and religion is often expressed in educational terms as the exclusive equation of critical thinking, inquiry, and openness with Western modernity and its system of liberal education, as against the automatic association of religious education with unquestioning submission of authority and rote learning of prescribed texts. This crude assumption fails to take account of the fact that critical thinking does not actually appear to figure very highly in the educational objectives of mainstream utilitarian schooling system in the West, which are increasingly governed by teacher-directed transmission and drilling of prescribed content. One opportunity was seen to stand out as a means to resolve outmoded dichotomies, and that is the way in which the renewal of a comprehensive Islamic vision of human faculties converges in many ways with the broad rationale of a holistic education. In fact, authentic principles of Islamic education support the reclamation of many dimensions of holistic education, which are increasingly neglected within mainstream schooling systems. Thank you.
Now I call Mr. Chad to talk on the theme of gender and equality. Sexuality.
I don't know if I should say this, but an anti-Muslim bigot looking at us would say, typical bloody Muslims, they don't even allow a woman to have her own voice. Instead they give her a text to read. Before I say something about gender and sexualities, I just want to make a couple of points about the reflection of, reflecting back on the first phase of the project in the first report. There was a certain amount of feedback, of course, which we took into consideration. One was that the first report was excessively theoretical, basically boring. And the other one was that we didn't consider issues which are very practical, in-your-face issues. And so we tried to deal with this by making our discussions more exciting, of course, telling a few jokes along the way, but also by integrating, showcasing projects, practitioner projects, which we thought were really worthy and worth discussing, but also raising issues that people who work within communities bring up. So when we deal with questions of gender, for example, and of course, let's not forget, gender is not just about women. the totemic idea that it's all about women in Islam. Gender, of course, is also about men, and we discussed quite extensively issues such as the crisis of masculinity. Even when we're talking about issues around gender, it's not just very abstract notions about how we talk about God or what the implication that has with respect to gender, issues around the possibility of Islamic feminism or feminist theology within Islam, but also some of the issues were very practical, such as how do women in certain communities in certain parts of the country get access to mosques? How do you deal with very real issues around what are called honor killings or FGM, or issues around forced marriage, or very practical things which actually happen, which need to be addressed. And for me, one of the really good things about the project is, as an academic, it forces you to deal with the real world again, and to realize actually, academics, we do actually live in the real world, and sometimes some of these very concrete issues can force us to reflect even on the experiences that we have, which we sometimes don't necessarily consider ourselves to have expertise on. Now, as I mentioned before, the crisis of masculinity did come up, and we felt this was a very important issue because a number of the discussions which we had, and I would really want to stress that the discussions were actually quite rich. We tried to really describe this in the first report, but also in the second report, that actually contrary to some expectations, discussions and debate within Muslim communities in Britain is actually not very simplistic or monotone, but rather there are a number of diverse voices out there which we wanted to reflect that sort of plurality. On issues around gender, on issues around constrictions and the withholding of perhaps freedoms, what we'd call freedoms with respect to women, we felt that actually a number of these issues related to the crisis of masculinity. And that the way in which men, young guys might treat women, young girls, within our communities, but also more generally, had actually quite a lot to do with basic issues around role modeling. And how we could think about the sort of role models that people had, what sort of resources could you bring in from the theological traditions to deal with it, what sort of practical steps could you take in terms of projects which are taking place around the country in terms of role modeling particular types of individuals, looking at if the wider society considers sportsmen to be role models, well, what does that mean for Muslim context and so forth. And alongside that, there was also this notion that we needed to deal with some of the more perhaps difficult theoretical issues around the hermeneutics of the text. How do we allow texts to speak, and how in certain cases do we basically say no to texts, or at least to park texts on one side? And that also allowed us to get into issues around sexualities. I do remember those discussions being some of the more interesting discussions because we had huge disagreements, which is entirely to be expected. But if you look at the report eventually when it comes out, you will see there's a section on respectful difference. And this was absolutely key, that we could articulate different positions that we might have on issues around gender or around sexualities. But those differences did not constrict the possibilities of debate. They did not constrict the possibilities of doing research. So there was always alongside, if I just sum up quickly, the two themes, we always had theoretical considerations to take into account, but also issues which were very practical and on the ground. I said right at the beginning that one of the issues with the first report was that it was extremely boring, or at least I think I said that. Hopefully this one is not as boring, but even if it were to be boring, I will reiterate what I said before, which is boring is good, because ultimately boring is normal. And if we can continue the theme of basically suggesting that these discussions actually show how normal Muslims are, how normal Muslim women and men are, how they basically face very similar challenges to other citizens in the country, then it will have been a successful report. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sajjad. Just to say to you that we will be making available to you copies of the report. In the hope that you will not release it because we haven't actually officially launched it. Now, I'd like to call on Ed Kessler to come and give us his thoughts as a reader of the report and as an external assessor of our efforts. Ed, we are friends.
We are for now. Thank you very much, Yasser. Just to say, the Wolf Institute is delighted to support you and this conference. We've been a partner with the Centre of Islamic Studies for at least 3 years now,
yes,
running conferences and research programs, so I'm delighted to be here. Now, you asked me to review the report.
Yes.
And to highlight one or two things that stand out to me. And what stands out throughout the report is a desire for balance, not only in terms of canvassing and reporting different views, but in calling for a rebalance of the place, but also importantly, I think, the perception of Islam in Britain. This requires an honesty and a willingness to be self-critical, which I think the report aptly and commendably demonstrates. In particular, I welcome the desire to rebalance the individual in relationship to the community, to balance the spiritual and secular education, to balance gender relations, and I know you were saying also about the crisis of masculinity, but in particular, I think, the rights and needs of Muslim women. Now, the report also betrays a community that is profoundly aware not only of internal, but also external criticism, which can and does easily spill over into what we call Islamophobia, although in my group we had a big discussion about whether it was a useful term. Whether it's anti-Muslim prejudice, hatred, Islamophobia makes it hard for Muslim communities, I think, to be self-critical and less able to handle disagreement within and without the community. Now, one focus of the work of the Wolf Institute is the study of Muslim-Jewish relations, and when reading this report, much sounds extraordinarily familiar to a Jewish reader like myself. Jews also have faced discrimination in British society, have experienced difficulties in integrating, are concerned about their children's education, as well as generational transition and the role of the family, feel vulnerable as a minority community, and perhaps most pertinent of all, are still striving to achieve a balance. In other words, this remains and will remain an ongoing challenge for the Muslim communities, but for all of us. And I think if I share one story, you mentioned humour. I think humour is very important. It keeps everybody awake. But it also, certainly in the Jewish, and I think in the Muslim sense, and actually in the Christian sense, rings true. And I hope this story does. It's about a Jew from 19th century Warsaw. Warsaw had a big Jewish population before the war. And he went to New York. And when he came back, he told his friends what he saw. He said it was amazing. He said, I met a Jew who was a communist, and I met a Jew who was a capitalist. I met a Jew who was a Zionist, I met a Jew who was anti-Zionist, I met a Jew who was Reform, a Jew who was Orthodox, a Jew who was ultra-Orthodox, a Jew who was secular. And his friends said, well, what's so strange? There are lots of Jews in New York. He said, you don't understand, it was the same Jew. Now this demonstrates the challenge, obviously, of hybrid identities, but I wonder whether this is a Jewish version of the report's call for multiple concepts of the Ummah. Of course, there are not only similarities with the Jewish community, but also with Christians. In December, I was privileged to be in Rome with the chief rabbi and in conversation with Pope Benedict XVI, when a discussion took place about today's need to become, and I quote, creative minorities. Now, I don't know whether the chief rabbi or His Holiness had actually read your report before me.
Yes, he did.
He had. But the coincidence is remarkable because the report calls for Muslims to be a creative minority. So this is another way of saying, I think, that the Muslim community or communities are not alone in their desire to engage in society and not alone in their search for balance. Most of us, frankly, are. And one final thought. It is pleasing to see that some of the recommendations are already being put into practice. The Wolf Institute is pleased to be working with the Cambridge Muslim College, supporting a project examining Islamic education led by Matthew Tarrant Wilkinson. Indeed, the recent establishment of the Muslim College in Cambridge, and we have Atif here, is a sign that the need for better training of imams is being addressed. Although I say it's a great shame that the Muslim College in London is under threat of closure. Our own report on seminary training in Jewish, Christian and Muslim seminaries is also part of the mix. So, Yasser and all of you, many congratulations on what has been achieved. But if I can leave you with two areas which I suggest may need further consideration, and which are perhaps better addressed by the Muslim communities of this country than anywhere else, and if there are funders here, please listen. Firstly, the relationship with Europe. The European dimension may offer a very productive framework in which Muslims and others can find ways of becoming at ease with themselves and their desire for distinctiveness. Famously, Tariq Ramadan calls for a European Islam, which to me sounds like a call for a European Judaism, which some of us are looking towards, as key to the integration of Muslims in societies, in European societies, in a form that does not involve the loss of Islamic identity. And second, how better to handle the impact of violence and conflict overseas on and between our communities here in the UK. I'm thinking not only of the impact of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the wider Middle East, or as Yasser put it so nicely, West Asia, but other conflict situations such as in the subcontinent and sub-Saharan Africa. These conflicts impact heavily on our communities, and the speed of communication today means they impact here and they impact now. So thank you for contextualising Islam in Britain too, and I look forward to reading Contextualising in Islam in Britain 3 in about 18 months.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks. Now, if you want a test of what a friend is like, this is a very good test. So our friendship has emerged stronger now, Hugh, well, are you going to change things for us? So I will sort of send a letter of complaint to Prince Alwaleed and say, he hasn't.
Thanks very much, Yasser, and it's a great pleasure to offer one or two comments on this report from the other Alwaleed Centre in the UK, which is based in the University of Edinburgh, and not, as I think the publicity says, the University of Cambridge. So Freudian slip there, I'm sure. And it's particularly nice also to be participating in a sense what is a kind of Abrahamic comment on the report. And that indicates perhaps an interesting interreligious dimension to our discussion. Now, there is something rather exciting about a pre-launch panel because it has a slightly naughty feeling about it, as if one is a journalist who has just received a leaked document and is commenting on it rather furtively, doing something which they should not be doing. But this, I am assured, is all perfectly legitimate and above board, and will, I hope, be a contribution to the further reflection on the report. And as directors of films and novels know, sequels are, of course, risky ventures. You direct a film, you write a novel, and it goes down well, it's well received. There is then a follow-up, and you await the reception with some nervousness. People's expectations on the first effort are high, been raised by Volume 1. Are people's expectations going to be maintained by Volume 2? And the same is, of course, true with respect to writing a report. Well, let me remind you briefly, and we've had one or two references to this already, about Contextualising Islam in Britain 1, which was published in October 2009 and launched not too far away from here by the then Minister in the Department of Communities and Local Government, Shahid Malik, the first Muslim minister in a UK government. And the report contained an interesting discussion of the context within which Islam in Britain works, the demographic context, the socio-economic context, issues of multiculturalism, community cohesion, radicalization, and Islamophobia, so you can see the extent to which the same issues keep coming up, but with particular discussion of secularism, democracy, pluralism, human rights, and citizenship. And these are all, of course, terms which need careful definition and are in many contexts rather controversial. But Contextualising Islam 1 put these concepts very constructively in the context of the tradition of Islamic thought and of Islamic law in particular. And the report was commended by Dr. Mustafa Ceric, the Chief Mufti of Bosnia, as a significant contribution to Muslim thinking about living in Europe, not just, in other words, in Britain. And he commended the first report for its wisdom, boldness, and insight. Controversial themes discussed with judiciousness and in carefully nuanced comment, not minimizing disagreements where they also occurred, even if, of course, the use of the Chatham House rules meant that it wasn't possible to work out who was disagreeing with whom over what. That was not necessarily clear to a reader. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I can tell you that, in my view, Volume 2 continues this tradition very effectively and even developing the earlier discussion of Volume 1. The sequel, therefore, is good. I hope that's what the chair wanted to hear. Many, but not all, of the same participants have been involved, with some new blood and some new membership, and, as is often the case with these things, a significant expansion of content. We have 134 pages in Volume 2 as opposed to 82 in the first report. And commendations, therefore, to Professor Suleiman as the coordinator, the director of the project, and also to Jeremy Hensel-Thomas, although sadly he's not able to be here, as the main author. Now, as we heard, the report addresses four main themes, some of which were discussed in Volume 1, but which are now significantly expanded in Volume 2. The individual and community, and I was interested that Mohammed Abdulaziz didn't mention the Enlightenment in his little summary of the discussions that had evidently taken place about that, about gender, equality, identity and sexuality, about education, and about the wider society and the common good. Let me just perhaps tease out one or two sections which I personally found extremely interesting in the context of the discussion of the individual and the community. This is on pages 31 to 33 of the report. Very helpful distinction that's made between the individual and individualism. The two are not necessarily the same. And a traditional concept such as ijtihad, of course, necessarily involves reflection and comment by the individual. The question of inequality of access to mosques, particularly for women, has been mentioned again earlier in this session. And that section, in my view, discusses the practical difficulties very clearly, but also engages very constructively with the particular interpretation of certain traditional texts. That's pages 57 to 58. Critical thinking on pages 83 to 84, also very constructive, dynamic interpretation, scrutinizing evidence, examining assumptions, and making distinctions, very helpfully outlined. Though critical thinking, of course, is one of those terms that, because it has this kind of double meaning, does need to be used very carefully. And the word analytical, perhaps, may be more helpful in this context. Critical thinking about the life of the Prophet, critical studies of the Quran, obviously can set alarm bells ringing if the wrong sense of the word is being used in that context. And then towards the end, page 117, the section about a new Islamic public theology is a very helpful statement of the contributions which Islamic thought can make to the vexed question of the role of religion in modern Britain. But most impressive of all for my reading is the section from pages 63 to 68, Sexuality and Sexual Orientation, which discusses both, as Sajjad has outlined, the difficult theoretical, what we might call doctrinal issues, but also some of the practical pastoral issues with great sensitivity. And in his introduction, Professor Suleiman points to the fact that strong views were expressed on this issue on all sides, but with mutual respect. Now, I speak as a member of a religious community, the Worldwide Anglican Communion, which is currently tearing itself apart over this issue. And the problem with this question, whether you are an Anglican or a British Muslim, is that there's no agreement about what kind of issue this is. Is it a primary order issue, which is part of what is considered the fixed and unalterable core of the faith? Or is it a second order issue, teaching which has been heavily influenced by cultural norms of societies in the past, and is therefore perfectly amenable to change and revision? And the problem often is that the protagonists in the debate are unable to agree which category this issue fits into. For those for whom it is a primary issue, the fact that their opponents, if one can use that word, do not see it as such, makes the primary order group feel that the issue is not being taken seriously, being treated, if you like, with a certain amount of disrespect. And the same is true, of course, within the Anglican Communion, the vexed question of women priests and now women bishops within the Church of England. But on homosexuality in particular, there is the interesting little section in Tariq Ramadan's book, What I Believe, where he comments that the pendulum of opinion in the West and different Islamic societies has swung backwards and forwards over the course of the centuries on this, as of course on many other issues. And he remarks that when homosexuality in the West was considered to be a criminal offence, many homosexuals took refuge in certain parts of the Islamic world, for example, in Morocco. And now perhaps the pendulum in both societies has swung the other way, and I think of a conversation reported to me by a Methodist minister in the UK who had had a conversation with a young Jordanian refugee who had come out as gay in his home context, had been disowned by his family and the wider society, came to the UK and said to the Methodist minister, "What can your faith offer me? Is it the same, or is it something different?" And that story perhaps illustrates the extent to which this is a real existential issue for a significant proportion of human beings today. So that's a difficult issue, and again explored, I suggest, with wisdom, boldness and insight, the same characteristics which Dr. Cherich outlined with respect to the first volume. Possibly a brave discussion, even I might suggest a risque discussion, but nevertheless clearly carried out carefully and with great consideration. Commendation, therefore, of the report to all the participants, to Yasser as the coordinator, the director of the project, to Jeremy once again as the lead writer. And as and when a formal launch is being considered, and I did hear a reference to House of Lords, possibly, as a locus. And you take the words out of my mouth. I very much hope that it may be possible for a Scottish launch to take place as well, so that Northern Britain is also included in benefiting from the report. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks to all speakers, and what I'd like to do is just to open the floor for discussion. So it's your turn to get back at us. Yes. Do you have microphones? Yeah. Do you have one? Yeah. You start, Jocelyn, and then we'll speak up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
More comments on the question as such, but it goes back to the
Yeah.
discussion on individual and community, and also the comparative framework with Professor Alwaleed. I think that it is a very strong point to emphasize that in the Islamic tradition, the religious individual exists. And why is it not so obvious in the West? It's because the West has moved away from religious individual to secular individual. And the secular individual, by definition, doesn't put any limits on anything he or she does. I mean, nothing is, I would say, limited or constrained. Why? For religious individual, and this is not only for Muslims, it's true for any religious tradition. Think of the big mystical, experience. It's about strength. It's about limit. It's about, as you said, creating this connection with God in a different way. But it's not doing anything you want to do. If you ask anybody in the West, individualism is no limit, no boundaries of what they can do, which is not the case for any religious individual. So in this sense, I don't think that Muslims are specific. What is specific is that they maintain this tension in a context that has been heavily secularized, but the definition of individualism is about this complete freedom, that you can do anything you want, including to your body, to everything. So there is something here interesting, and why I'm mentioning that, because through the focus group we did across Europe, and I'm talking about lay Muslims, anonymous people, they express it, not in this theoretical term, but they feel this tension between what they consider having limits and living in an environment where there is no limit.
Okay.
And I think that what I wanted to ask you is about are the imams that participated in this seminar aware of, the people we interviewed in this focus group were very critical of their leadership in this regard, and not even being able to understand that.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions. Yeah, Farid.
First of all, I'd like to extend my congratulations on this report. I think it really seems very exciting. I look forward to reading it. But my questions are based on what I've heard rather than reading, so they are limited by that. 2 questions, I'm intrigued, and these are questions for clarification. One is the central question that you asked. What does it mean to live faithfully as a Muslim? And I would like to understand what faithfully means here. And because its definition would then shape the definition of who is considered as Muslim. So if some example is given, what does it mean to live unfaithfully? It should be the corollary of it. Secondly, because we are talking about theology, public theology as well, I'm interested in choices that have been made in theoretical parts. So going back to individual community, Parvez Mansoor and Iqbal chosen. If you had chosen Ashari and Maududi, you would have got quite different understanding of individual and community. And I'm sure similar choices were made in education, in gender. So how were these theoretical choices made to work with?
Thank you. So 2 points. I'll just come to the panel and come back to you. 2 points. the individual as a religious individual and a secular individual with no limits, and then the 2 points about what faithfully means, and then about the choice of sources that could lead you in different directions of defining the individual. Muhammad Abdulaziz, do you want to come and answer from here, or do you want to answer from here? Because I take it that,
Yeah. No, I think essentially it was a comment with a very small question at the tail end. And I agree with the comment. I mean, I think what we were trying to get at is the relationship between the individual within the Muslim community, whether within the religious framework or the secular framework, and the community itself, and the pressures that the community puts on the individual within the Muslim community. And one of the key findings was actually that the theological stuff was, in many cases, aside. More often, the pressures from the community on the individual were based on cultural issues. So, for example, if you take any number of issues that I would have touched on if I had a little bit more time. So whether it's forced marriages, cousin marriages, violence based on honor, is the role of woman, etc., etc. So much of it is to do with so much else other than theology. And we were trying to understand all of that as well, and then try and put a framework around those issues with regards to the individual as well as the community. So there was a whole sort of complex set of dynamics going on there within that discussion. In terms of whether or not the imams are aware of the issues that you mentioned, I think we had a fantastic group of imams actually from very, very diverse and different backgrounds, from different schools of thought, etc., etc. And they were aware. They were aware of the issues, the difficulties the young people were facing, the imams were facing, etc., etc. And on the whole, they wanted to address these issues. But so often, they also felt bound by other things happening within their community. So, in fact, when we did the first report, we went for a very, very soft launch. And the reason for going for a soft launch was because the imams had said many things, and we'd included many things in that report which they stood by, but they were afraid that if some of this stuff went back to their communities, then it would impact on them as a leader or member of that community, etc., etc. So we had to be aware of all of those dynamics as well in terms of the work we were doing. The second issue as to how we chose the scholars, how we chose the issues, etc., etc. We tried to be as diverse as possible. I mean, that was one of the sort of conditions that we put on Yasser from government to say, well, look, you have to have Sunnis in there, you have to have Shias in there, you have to have Brelvis in there, you have to have the Abandis in there, you have to have Sufis in there, Salafis in there. We want everybody in there, the modernists, the progressives, we want everybody in there. And we want them to be selected from imams, from community leaders, from academics, from different disciplines, etc., etc. And then within that group, we asked various people to present papers on various topics. So to some extent it was left to those speakers, but the pool that we had was quite diverse. Now, within a project like that, we're never going to be as comprehensive as we would like it to have been in terms of the scholars that were represented, the ideas that were represented, etc., etc. But the papers and the ideas and the scholars that were put forward to the group for discussion were just a snapshot to get these sort of discussions going. And that was the important thing, to have some material on the table to get the discussions going. And then, as Sajjad said, once the discussion started, they became very, very rich, with scholars from Sufism, Shiism, Sunnism, everywhere. And just a variety of people here are a testimony of that, I suppose, well, in this case, 2 Shia and 1 Sunni. But I suppose this is a testament of the variety that we had within the group.
No, but as a chair, I don't count the trolls. So.
He was neutral. He was a very neutral chair.
I was, yeah. To say it faithfully, I think, just to put it within that context, which is very important to talk about. Now, we have not sort of imposed a uniform interpretation. We left it to individuals to decide for themselves whether they lived faithfully or not. For example, the sexuality discussion, which was a very, very rich discussion. Actually, we always try to put ourselves in very uncomfortable positions as a group. So we brought in a person who's a practicing, who's actually has a different lifestyle, a different orientation. Now, some people consider that to be unfaithful to a Muslim way of life. Others consider it to be faithful. We could not say, well, this is a faithful way of practicing Islam in Britain. We left it to people, to individuals, to define for themselves and then to bring that to the table for discussion amongst this rich and diverse and sometimes very fractious group. And believe you me, I mean, chairing those meetings, I should perhaps be given a Nobel Prize for chairing those meetings. After the first seminar of the first report, the Vice Chancellor was very, very concerned about this. So she asked to see me on the Monday morning. Because for Cambridge, it's not about money, it's about risk, and there's a huge risk here. And then I said to the group, what do I say to the Vice Chancellor? I'm going to say to her, it's succeeded. And it was Alison Richard at the time. And then I said, she's going to ask me, yes, sir, how do you know it had succeeded? And Aniston volunteered the answer, and he said, tell her that we all know each other except you. We have met in the past several times. We shouted at each other. We stormed out of the room. This time we stayed together without shouting at each other, without storming out of the room. And that was an indication of success, right? So it was a group that was very fractious, but at the same time willing to engage in a very sometimes uncomfortable discussion. And faithfulness to Islam was left to the individuals to define. And we've accepted what people had presented after that. Now, here you wanted to ask a question, and I'm just, Suad, and then I'm going to take 3. If you could just be really brief in your, so that we can get the discussion done.
Yeah, it seems from the presentations that have been given that such issues as individual and community and gender inequality and education have helped contextualize Islam in Britain. My question is, does that mean that this has indeed helped also defeat Islamophobia? Because it seems so far that Islamophobia is on the rise in the rest of Europe. So to what extent this contextualization has put an end to Islamophobia in this country? The next point is about education, because the talk was about Islamic education. I find this term rather ambiguous. What do you mean by Islamic education? Is it theological education? Is it Quranic school education? Or is it education of Muslims in Britain? I would love if someone can explain that in rather simple terms. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Yeah, thank you. There was somebody, I can't remember. Yes, Suad, and then I'll come to you.
Thank you. That's a very bold and courageous project you've taken on. My hat's off to you. One of the things I was struck by is the use of categories that must have had a much richer conversation in your discussions than you were able to present in your 5-minute presentation. So if I could ask you to address them maybe at a little bit greater length. One is the very idea of a series of binaries that you posed when so many of us are struggling with the very idea of throwing out binaries. For example, the individual and community sets up a binary which presumes that there is such a thing as a community. And yet you are very rightly complexifying the idea of community by making sure that you've got Sunnis and Shias and Salafis, etc. So in some way, what does it mean to bring under one umbrella something that you call a community to which you oppose the individual or ask what that relationship is? That's one binary. Another is West versus Islam. West is a regional area. Islam is a religious category. And yet there's many who have been trying to explode or implode that category. So, and you obviously were trying to do so in your conversations, if you could address that. And the other is secular and religious, which again is another binary that so many are trying to complicate, and no doubt in your conversations there were efforts to complicate that. If you could bring that out much more in your discussion.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks again, all of you. Barakallah feek. And Sajjad mentioned that there were issues about hermeneutics that had to be developed, how to approach interpretation of the text. And Professor Goddard mentioned that deciding whether something's a primary order, i.e. an ethical, unconditional, transhistorical, principle that you can't change, versus something that's subject to historical, contextual moments in the tradition. I wondered, did you wrestle with, and how might you have thought through the idea of historical change in the tradition as a precedent to open up discussion for what might be relevant to Britain, and how you negotiated that? Because that could be a very complex project. Did you wrestle with it? And if so, how did you manage the idea of historical change within the Islamic tradition?
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to turn to the panel. Shanul, do you want to say anything about education?
I can certainly attempt. Okay, so my remarks that I'm about to make are really not as an educationist in that sense. That's not my forte. Really, Jeremy is the person, and many others here, including Muhammad Abdulaziz, who can speak from that. But in terms of the discussions that were had and the kind of issues that were raised, talking about definitions of what is Islamic education, as you rightly posed, I think we deliberately chose not to tailor it to one or the other, not to fix it to one or the other. So if you look in the report, we pick up issues around, well, what are the challenges of, for example, Muslim children who are studying in mainstream schools? Because after all, 97% of Muslim children are studying in mainstream schools. So how is their education and their needs, spiritual, moral, etc., how are those being addressed, making sure that based on the 2010 legislation that has come in, where religion and its understanding and its practice for all its children should be upheld. So it was picking up those kinds of issues versus also picking up, for example, inequalities in education. So we know that almost a third of the Muslim population that is in a working age group, so between 16 to 64, for example, is seen as not really having any formal qualifications. So what is the impact of that going to have in terms of Muslims growing up here? And when we are talking about role models, for example, for the children, so one of the big things that was brought out is that there are not enough headmasters or people in senior teaching positions, for example, in educational roles, who are Muslims and therefore can be role models. We compared to, for example, medical doctors, whom we have a far larger percentage of medical doctors who are Muslim compared to the population. So these kinds of differences and what issues they bring up are certainly some of the debates we had. We also had debates around what does madrasa education look like in Britain? Being very mindful that there is no one size fits all. So there are different kinds of madrasas. There are some which actually pick up issues about how do we truly educate the children who come to the madrasa as good citizens of the country, along with being Muslim, and how those values are actually integrated towards making them a much more, growing up as public intellectuals, growing up as responsible citizens of the country. We also have, of course, issues around madrasas where there are issues about improper behavior, about teachers not being properly qualified, about pedagogies that are used that are seen as not effective in terms of children's learning. So all of these things were brought in, and the section on education in the report picks up these various elements around education. And sometimes we left it as problems, as debates to be still had, as a work in progress, to say this is what the picture looks like, this is how complex it is, this is how nuanced it is. Sometimes we actually were able to get to much better understandings to say, okay, as working definitions, here are the ways in which you could address those. So I suppose what I've tried to do is give you the kind of complexity of the discussions we had. In the report, substantiates this far better than I can in terms of various pieces of legislation, various reports that have been done, various acts that have been had. So those are really, as I say, not my forte, so I wouldn't kind of necessarily venture into those. But the report certainly does. It provides substantive footnoting to some of these areas of work. For example, the training of imams and the work that is being done under that whole area as well. To how do we ensure that even the imams themselves are better trained to provide those kind of educational perspectives. So those are just some thoughts and reflections on it.
Thanks, Shainu. Well, I'm going to ask Sajjad to address hermeneutics next, but while he's preparing himself, I just want to say something too. We also injected into the discussion of education is how does Islam get into the individual? How does Islam think of the individual? Right? What sorts of things, does it say about the individual? And to what extent some of those things can be turned into implementable kind of teaching, learning sort of programs. We brought then the notion of tarbiyah. It's not just education, it's also tarbiyah that comes into it. So it's about trying to say that in Islam there are certain thrusts of thought about the person, the individual, the maturation of the person to become a very active member of a community and communities, not just a community, communities. And that had to be sort of brought in. And we did not pit that against secular education. We said secular education has good things, but also sometimes has some blind spots. And Islamic education can also have some blind spots. And we need to balance those against each other. So Jad, would you like to address the question of hermeneutics? And then I'll come to you, Muhammad Aziz, for the binaries.
Last words.
Yeah.
You asked the really difficult question. My first response would be we didn't come up with final answers on anything. And in fact, that was part of the point, was that we wanted to get away from this position where, like a journalist comes to you and says, what does Islam say about halal meat? Or, or sort of, burkinis and stuff like that. And you want to get away from giving a straightforward answer, which is Islam says this. What does Islam say about homosexuality? Islam says this. We wanted to get precisely away from that kind of approach and to problematize it. And the question of hermeneutics, of course, around the table people had different zones of comfort, very different zones of comfort. And it was wonderfully chaired by Yasser. But for example, my role, and sometimes Aziz's role, was we were the provocateurs. We were supposed to go in there and stir things up by saying, well, actually, maybe there is an argument you can make from the Quran about homosexuality. There's no issue, and in fact, even sodomy is not an issue. And that would be, for many people, really problematic. Or to even sort of say, well, how do we understand what it means to even call, sodomy a sin? And I can't remember if it was in that context or maybe it was a different context. I heard this joke about, someone going to an imam and saying, I don't think sodomy is a sin. And the imam responds by saying, but you're not trying hard enough, clearly. So, there are different ways in which you might deal with the issue. But we did, for example, raise the kind of amna wudud issue, which is saying no to the text. That came up. That absolutely came up. And people have different positions on that. Similarly, there's a recognition that there are evolving ways in which we understand questions. Again, with respect to sexualities, in the modern period, we're talking about identities. Is it meaningful to talk about homosexuality in 9th century Baghdad? Is it meaningful to even talk about atheism in 9th century Baghdad? These are important questions, which I think a lot of people were very aware of. And I think we do a disservice to quite a lot of religious leaders around the country if we don't actually recognize that they get it. They absolutely get it. They might not always say so openly, but they actually do quite get it. And it was actually, for me, realizing that Salafis can actually be quite reasonable people and are entirely capable of getting it as well.
Thanks, Sajjad. Muhammad Aziz?
Let me just pick up on two issues very, very quickly. One on whether it reduced Islamophobia, and the other one is on the issue of binaries.
I will take the Islamophobia one.
Okay, all right. The question on binaries, it's absolutely that. We started off with lots and lots of binaries, and that was the point, because that's what Muslims have to deal with on a daily basis, whether it's Muslim academics, or Muslims in a community, or Muslim representatives working on policy issues, etc., etc. The binaries are the things that we have to deal with on a daily basis, and that's exactly where we started. But as with my presentation, we started off with this binary that, there is more emphasis in Islam on community, and there's more emphasis in the Western arena or Western thought on individualism, and very, very quickly, those binaries started falling apart. And then you started getting the very, very rich, textured, multi-layered discussions. And one of the discussions that we had, actually, one of the most fascinating discussions I think we had between the two, was this whole discussion around whether law should inform morality or morality should inform law. This was in the, and it went on for at least a whole day. And the discussion, I mean, I can't recall all these sort of complexities of discussion now, but if you go back to the first report, it's captured there very, very well. But it was that level of simplicity to start off with, and then ending up with a very, very rich, diverse discussions that was going not just in terms of the many, many sort of strands within Islam that were represented there, but the many, many experiences that were represented there. And the flip side of all of that is also that whilst there was all these sort of differences within the Muslims that were there, the number of touch points, commonalities with the discourses and discussions out there were also very, very amazing. So many Muslims within that room saying so many things which you would find in the corridors of a British university, whether on human rights or ethics or morality, etc., etc. And so many of those views would not traditionally be seen as Muslim views, but they were Muslim views backed up by Muslim texts, by Muslims within that room. And that was also very, very interesting.
I chose Islamophobia because I thought that was an easy question to answer, but it might be that's the wrong choice. I should have given it to Muhammad. I just wanted to say to you, that wasn't really something that we weren't actually setting out to deal with it at all. We were not trying to counter Islamophobia. That wasn't one of our concerns. As a direct primary concern, it might be a consequence of what we have done, but it wasn't. We were not there to say we really want to counter it. We were there to have a very rich, diverse conversation which will deal with topics of interest to Muslim and non-Muslims in Britain, and give our own perspective, recognizing that there are other perspectives on these issues as a group of people. That's what we tried to do. And in trying to do this, of course, as I said, we constantly tried to put ourselves in very uncomfortable situations. I have we are running we have just finished another project called Narratives of Conversion to Islam, Female Perspectives, and it's a 3-year project. We're coming to meals now. And there are 2 members of that project here. And there also, we put ourselves into very, very difficult, very uncomfortable situations. What we believe in is that in order to get a conversation going, you actually have to have gaps. Communication is built around reasonable gaps being in existence amongst people. Because if you don't have these gaps, then you're not going to have a really fruitful conversation. Now, the report, of course, is a summary of some of our, and therefore we're aware that this report will be in the public domain to be read by, we hope, policymakers, journalists, and others, but also members of Muslim communities and other communities. And therefore, in writing it, we have sometimes to simplify, to streamline, and sometimes to sacrifice some theoretical precision for the sake of readability, accessibility, and delivering a message. So the report, I'm not saying the report will contain all the nuance, but it contains enough of the nuance to give you an idea about the rich array of themes inside it. Now, I'm going to come to a close, but the question is, where do we go from here? And I think I'm going to connect a little bit with what Jocelyn was asking in our sort of breakout session. What we are trying to do now is we have produced an executive summary, and we're now going to have to go into roadshows after the official launch. We're going to go out into different parts of the United Kingdom, bring different communities to talk about the report. We will give them, we'll make the executive summary, which is about 20 pages, available to them, and the main report can be also available to them if they want to. And the idea is we can't, from here, reach everybody, but we have enough champions who took part in the report who will then become the champions for that report and then take it out into roadshows into different parts of the United Kingdom. That is the model that we have. So, for example, we have kindly accepted the offer to have a launch in the Scottish Parliament, but also from there go to Glasgow, perhaps with Shainul, where Shainul has also contacts there. So the idea is not just to keep it between two covers, but to take it into communities to look at it, and if there is interest, of course, to take it forward. Now, to me, as the person who's just chairing it, and what really struck me about it is the fact that, and this is something I think that Sajjad and others said, people came initially with very entrenched positions, and they were sort of setting themselves up to defend those positions. What we discovered is this, that when people, and we had also that, you remember Imelda with sexuality in the narratives of conversion to Islam, when people feel safe, it's amazing what happens. What happens is that people open up, they start to talk to each other, they start to exchange ideas, and then positions start to shift. And you get a richer discourse and a richer kind of agreement and disagreement. And this provides us with a model, somehow, for things outside these little, limited projects. Is that what we need to do is to open up conversations, not to shy away from difficult issues, and to see what the result of those things will be. I was very lucky to have actually been involved in this, although sometimes I used to blame Anas and Muhammad Abdulaziz for having brought me into it, because the Muslim community, believe it or not, has enormous egos. I mean, they just come and there's grandstanding, there's all of that. But our plan was not to work with the generals and the brigadiers. We decided to work with the lieutenants, because we thought those people lower down within the Muslim community, they would be able to take risks, and they just took the risks and produced this, what we think is a very useful report. I want to thank all our panelists today, especially to thank you and Ed for having taken the time to read it and to comment on it, and to thank you for coming here, to thank also Rihan, because Rihan from DCLG was sort of our contact point. They do not want to be publicly acknowledged, but we have done it, because the government is trying to keep a big distance from this report, right? We are happy that they are doing that, because we set out to also keep a big distance between us and the government. But just thank you very much indeed. What we're going to do, you all got, I hope, an executive summary copy. The report, this is the report here, and there are a few copies, Sayyid, yes, of the old report. Right, so there are copies of the report here and copies outside. Please take one if you are interested. Now, I have asked the staff here to ensure that all those copies that are going to be left in the rubbish bins in your rooms to be collected and given back to us, right? So that we can give them to other people. So don't be ashamed to take it, leave it in the rubbish bin, it will be collected, and then we'll just give it to somebody else. But I'm sure that once you've opened it, you would want to ask for another copy to give it as a present to your friends on Christmas. Thank you very much.